good talking to you, my friend. And honestly, when was the last time we even saw each other or actually spoke to each other?
Now, let me see.
Okay, I will stop you there because if I don't, this whole recording will be done before you can even remember. But
No,
how are you?
hey, let me say this. I remember
Okay,
seeing you, Rudy, sometime after you had left 680.
okay,
And there, it was more than once. So
yes.
that's my recollection.
I will take that. How are you doing, my friend? How you keeping, especially since the world has been changing so much every year?
Well, I would say this that thinking back on where we were at the start of the pandemic to where we are now,
Mhm.
it's really been night and day because while we all suffered from the COVID pandemic, some personally, in terms of the unfortunate ones who got it, and those who had to live under the conditions, and I'm one of those who had to live under the conditions. We're a long way from where we were in March 2020. Um, First of all, we pivoted from producing music festivals, um, the last being the Irie Music Festival, which we have done for 20 years, to developing what was initially an effort to archive all the content of Word Magazine, which carried on for about 20 years. And the more we looked at what we had in terms of music content from the two music festivals that we were largely responsible for creating, the Toronto Urban Music Festival and the Irie Music Festival, we looked at those two, we looked at Word Magazine and realized that the common thread throughout that experience was music. And so we felt, what do we do with all this music content? We started looking around and discovered that um, there wasn't a Black music archives that had not just looked at the information that was occurring and happening here in Toronto, but across the province, and nothing. We looked further across the country, and we found nothing in terms of a repository that would research, document, preserve the history of Canadian Black musicians in a way that could be accessible for the public and as an educational resource. So we said, why not us? So my wife and I, Donna, decided that that was going to be what we would do throughout the pandemic, which had basically put a stop on producing music festivals.
When we talk about this new venture, it sounds like it's something that is extremely needed. So let's jump right into it because the launch happened just a short time ago. What
Yes.
was the new launch? What is this called? And actually, how is it going to be? What is it exactly? And how is it preserving this part of Canadian culture?
Well, it is called the Canada Black Music Archives, and a lot of people have, you know, referred to it as Canadian Black Music Archives, and that's incorrect. I understand that, but that's not what it's called. And the Canada Black Music Archives, our mission is to document the last 100 years of Canadian Black music history by looking at artists who've made a contribution over those years, going back all the way to the 1800s, um, all the way up to the current times, and looking at Black musicians who are largely forgotten because, you know, the way things are structured in the music industry here, it's very hard for you to be an independent artist and get the requisite attention that you justifiably should command, but that's not how the industry works. If you look at the music industry and you look at the media industry, the guys who get the attention tend to be with the large labels and the guys who can afford to hire a publicist. Well, in a weird sort of way, we are bringing those artists back to life, those who have moved on, transitioned, and trying to re-examine what they've done that would allow them to be remembered in a positive, celebratory way. So we have to date posted over 100 Canadian Black artists, musicians who we felt have made a significant contribution that's beyond winning a national award. Let's say the Junos, for example, or the Polaris Awards, for example. Folks who we feel, in our estimation, have made a significant contribution and ought to be acknowledged and remembered, and they will be recorded in this repository, the archive, so that their life stories are not just lost, in a way that is the norm. The example that I usually use, Rudy, is the film Hidden Figures, which was a movie that came out in the 2000s that, told the story about these African-American female mathematicians. Think about that. Female mathematicians whose story were never properly acknowledged. Yes, there's a Hollywood film, but nobody prior to that knew about the seminal work that they did to help NASA get into space. Yeah. So I think that's an apt comparison for me when you think about all these artists who have come up through the years, guys not known. There's Oscar Peterson. Everybody knows Oscar, and bless his heart, rest in peace. There are, the Drakes and the Weekends of this world. You might get Deborah Cox and you get, Maestro. But trust me when I say this, when we began working with these interns, the question I would ask my interns is, can you name me 6 Canadian Black music artists from the past or current artists? And believe me, nobody got that right. No. They could easily tell you about a dozen plus African-American artists, but like we've seen so many times before, Canadian artists and Canadian history, whether it's music history or, in this case, other pieces of history, we don't do a good job of teaching that to the next generation. And so being a father myself, I felt this is one area where I could contribute, to the educational system, to the GLAM sector, the galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, whose job it is to tell not just one slice of Canadian history, but all of Canadian history. So we're coming at this with the perspective that Canadian Black music history is Canada Black music history.
Okay, so give me a name from somebody who is in these archives that maybe we wouldn't know about. And then how is it presented? Is it on a website? How does it work?
Well, let me deal with the how does it work, for example, first. Here's how it works. A team of our interns will research an artist. Let's say Daisy Peterson Sweeney, who is the sister of Oscar Peterson. She's never recorded an album, okay? She was still influential in the creation of the Montreal Jubilation Choir. She taught Oscar Peterson how to play the piano. She taught Oliver Jones how to play the piano, and she taught Joe Seeley, another great, and she taught good friend of mine, Russell Kelly, who's a folk artist that most people don't know about, great songwriter. He was also mentored by Daisy Peterson Sweeney. Now, I hope someone can give me a good reason why she would not be in a Canada Music Archives, given that incredible accomplishment.
So now she's archived. So where exactly is the archive? Like I asked before, is it on a website? Is it a facility? Where do we
Yes.
go to actually see and learn about this?
Well, great question. And where we go to see this, because we are a digital archive, and I'll come back to that in a minute. This is a digital archive, making it accessible to all of Canada. Now, you and I live in Toronto.
Yeah.
And if we had positioned this somewhere in Toronto, yes, you could easily get to it. But how about the rest of the country? You know, we live in one of the largest land masses in the world in this country called Canada. So if you wanted to conduct research, you would have a tough time if you're living in Halifax to get all the way to Toronto and do what you do and get back home without spending a fortune. Okay. So typically these are, students doing research at universities. A lot of them are post-grad students doing the research. A lot of them are other museums that might require this information. We're saying, wait a minute, here's what we saw during the pandemic. There are institutions, legacy institutions, that lost as many as 90% of their audience because of the shutdown. Yeah. We also saw that in the US, MoMA, for example, was willing to sell, I think, $70 million worth of its collections to expand its digital footprint. Now, what that tells us is we shifted to being digital, most of us working from homes, not going into the office and things like that to avoid the pandemic. But it changed our way of life. Yeah. And we were responding to this need to make it accessible for those who have access online and to provide people with information, whether it's on mobile or whether it's on their desktop, you could easily access this information. And if we're making it an educational resource, should it not then be as widely accessible as possible? Well, the answer is yes. So that's what we set as the task for ourselves. And so when you come to the archive at the cbma.com, you'll find that we were reimagining what an archive can look like. What do I mean by that? It means that not only will you see a bio of an artist, you will see photographs. You'll also videos. You also see videos if we have access to videos, depending on when the artist was active. And you'll also be able to see a discography of that artist in terms of the music. For Oscar Peterson, as an example, Oscar was involved in over 200 recordings. Yeah. That if I, as a huge fan of Mr. Peterson, wanted to find out where that is, now I have a one-stop area called the cbma.com where I can go and pull this information together. And I'll tell you one more thing. There were people like the folks handling the Oscar Peterson estate who said to me, this is a great idea because now this information can be shared. There were people like Dan Hill's management folks were saying, great, this is needed. You know what I mean? And Molly Johnson, who says, great idea. And Jay Douglas, who said, look, I've been performing for over 45 years, going back to the 60s in this country, and it's now finally there's a place for us, oftentimes the forgotten artists who've made a contribution.
True, true, absolutely true. As we're slowly wrapping this up, do you need funding?
Absolutely, my friend. We do need funding. Most of this has been done by volunteers and student interns who, as part of their programs, wanted to get some real life experiences. So we've been working with nearly 30 interns over the past 3 years, who've all contributed. You know, they've got great research skills, some have great web skills, some have great social media skills, and various other content writing skills that have come to the table, have offered their help. And one of the fascinating things about this, Rudy, is that I liken it to the Benetton commercials based on the diversity of young Canadians who
Yes.
strongly believe that this needs to be here. They want to learn about the country in all its aspect. And we know that Black folks have made a disproportionate contribution to the music industry. If you're looking at North American wide, it's beyond a shadow of doubt. And certainly here, based on the information that we're finding and discovering, that is also the case in Canada.
Okay, well, I think this is an amazing thing to have. I think it's extremely important. Very, very last question. Though we are talking digital, would you like to see some kind of physical aspect to it one day? Maybe a touring exhibit in some way that could happen in the future.
Well, Rudy, you've just hit the nail on the head. Will remain a digital entity because of the accessibility issues, but
Mhm.
touring, absolutely. Pop-ups, you know, we had a pop-up launch at City of Toronto Archives, and out of that grew, you know, some ideas in terms of taking it to Montreal,
Yeah.
taking it to Halifax. Next year, for example, the Junos are taking place in Halifax. We would love nothing better than to have a pop-up there. And a pop-up could be a day, a pop-up could be longer, where we can share this information and bring people to what we're doing, and have them submit names that we may not know, have them donate to help us do this kind of work. And ultimately, I think we need to have physical exhibits, if you will, that brings people in and share this knowledge and information with them. So it won't be exclusively online. Yes, that's our home, but the idea of pop-ups and exhibitions are very much in keeping with what we're trying to accomplish.
I think this is amazing. Phil, I got to say, man, always thinking. Thank you so much for the interview, but thank you so much for preserving a part of Canadian history that needs to be preserved. Thank you so much for this interview, my friend.
Thank you so much, Rudy. And back at you, man. Like I said, I made reference to 680, but I know your work extends way beyond 680, and I see you putting in the work, and you're a role model for so many young ones coming up. My hope is that we can be the role model for the next generation. This archives is not just for the current generation, but for the future generation. And I want to be able to have my children understand that they are Canadians and Black history belong in Canada, because we've been here since 1601.
Mhm. Amen to that. Thank you again.